The dust had not settled on the road behind her wagon before Caroline Lockhart realized she was more lost than she had ever been in her 26 years of living, and that the only structure standing for miles in any direction was a ranch she was absolutely certain no living soul had touched in years. She pulled the reins of her roan mare to a slow stop, standing up slightly in the buckboard seat to get a better look at the property spread out before her across the flat Texas scrubland. The year was 1883, and the western reaches of the Lone Star State still carried that particular kind of wildness that made even seasoned travelers think twice about their choices. Caroline was not a seasoned traveler. She was a newspaper correspondent from Philadelphia who had taken a commission from the Eastern Illustrated Weekly to document life on the frontier, armed with a leather satchel full of notebooks, a camera that weighed nearly 20 pounds, and an optimism that the Texas landscape was doing its very best to dismantle piece by piece. The ranch sat behind a weathered fence line of cedar posts and rusted wire that sagged in long, tired arcs between each post. The main house was a low, solid structure of rough-cut limestone, its porch roof drooping slightly on the left side, a rocking chair sitting motionless in the afternoon heat. Behind the house she could make out a barn, large and dark-timbered, and beyond that several corrals built of good, thick mesquite rails. The corrals, she noticed, were in surprisingly solid repair compared to everything else. That struck her as odd, but she was distracted almost immediately by the more pressing question of whether anyone was home. She had been following a route given to her in Abilene by a storekeeper who had promised her that the road would take her straight to the town of Harlow Creek in about 4 hours. That had been 6 hours ago. The road had split twice where the storekeeper had assured her it would not split at all, and the last water she had given to her mare was at a creek crossing some 3 miles back. The sun was already tilting toward the western hills, and she had no desire whatsoever to spend the night in open country where coyotes sang and worse things prowled. She climbed down from the buckboard, her skirts catching the dry wind, and pushed open the ranch gate. It swung with a long, mournful creak that scattered a handful of sparrows from the fence wire. She led the mare through and tied her to the hitching post near the porch steps, patting the animal's dusty neck with genuine affection. "Hello," she called out, stepping up onto the porch. "Is anyone here? I'm not here to cause trouble. I am simply a bit turned around and I would very much appreciate directions." Silence answered her. The rocking chair did not move. A yellow cat appeared from around the corner of the porch, regarded her with the flat indifference that cats have perfected across all centuries, and then slipped back around the corner without offering any useful information. She tried knocking on the door. The sound of it rang hollow and deep against the thick wood, and nobody came. She pressed her ear to the door and heard nothing within. She tried knocking again, louder this time, and still nothing. She stepped back and looked at the place with the trained eye of a woman who had spent the past 3 months documenting frontier life. The porch was swept. Not recently, perhaps, but it had been swept deliberately, and there was a neat coil of rope hanging on a peg beside the door that showed no signs of weathering. There was a boot scraper beside the steps, a plain iron thing, and there was a smear of recent mud on its edge. The ranch was not abandoned. Someone lived here, and that someone was simply not home at this particular moment. This changed the situation considerably. She could wait. She had water in a canteen, a heel of bread wrapped in cloth, and a stubborn streak wide enough to drive a wagon through. She sat down in the rocking chair, pulled out her notebook, and began sketching the landscape while the sun moved westward and the shadows of the cedar posts lengthened across the dry grass. She had filled 2 pages of notes and was beginning a third when she heard it. The distant rhythm of hoofbeats coming from the south, growing steadily louder, accompanied by the low, easy sound of someone whistling a tune she did not immediately recognize. She stood up and shaded her eyes. The rider came over the low rise south of the house at an easy lope, pushing a small group of cattle ahead of him. He was tall in the saddle, lean through the shoulders, wearing a battered brown hat so shaped by years of weather and habit that it sat on his head with the particular authority of something that had given up trying to be anything other than exactly what it was. He had dark hair visible beneath the hat's brim, and even at this distance she could see that he sat a horse the way some men sit in their own parlors, completely at ease and completely in command. She raised her hand in a wave. He saw her immediately. There was a brief pause in his forward motion, just a second, just enough to tell her that she had surprised him. Then he continued on, guiding the cattle with practiced small movements through a gate into the nearest corral, latching it behind them with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Then he turned his horse toward the house. He was perhaps 30, she thought as he drew closer. Maybe a year or two more. His face was weathered copper-brown from years of outdoor living, with a jaw that could have been carved with a straight edge, and eyes the color of strong creek water in summer, a deep, clear gray-green that caught the late afternoon light in a way she found unexpectedly striking. He stopped his horse about 10 feet from the porch and looked at her from beneath the brim of his hat with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was extremely careful. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying the dry cadence of a man who chose his words with care because he had learned long ago that they mattered. "Good afternoon," she said. "My name is Caroline Lockhart. I was told by a man in Abilene that this road would bring me to Harlow Creek in 4 hours. That was 6 hours ago. I believe I may have made a wrong turn." He studied her for a moment. "2 of them," he said. "You made 2 wrong turns." I suspected as much. She did not look particularly flustered by this admission, which seemed to interest him. "Is this your ranch?" "It is." He swung down from the horse with a single fluid motion and hitched the reins to the post opposite where her mare stood. He pulled his hat off as he stepped toward the porch, and she saw his face more clearly then, the intelligence in those gray-green eyes and something else she could not quite name, something that lived behind the caution, something quiet and watchful and she thought perhaps a little lonely. "Harlan Watkins." He extended his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm without being performative about it. "Caroline Lockhart," she said again, though she had already told him that. "I apologize for trespassing on your property, Mr. Watkins. I knocked and no one answered, and I decided the porch was more sensible than the road." "It is," he agreed, without any apparent irritation. "You hungry?" The directness of it surprised her. "I beg your pardon. It's supper time. I was going to cook. You can eat, and then I will put you on the right road before it gets fully dark." She considered this. The Philadelphia part of her brain raised a small, polite objection about the propriety of dining alone with a stranger in the middle of the Texas wilderness. The practical part of her brain, which had grown considerably louder over 3 months of frontier correspondence work, pointed out that she was hungry, that the bread in her satchel was stale, and that the man had honest eyes. "That is very kind of you," she said. "I would be grateful." He nodded once, as if the matter was settled, and led his horse around to the barn. She remained on the porch, listening to the sounds of him unsaddling and tending the animal, and she found herself noticing the care with which he did it. The murmured words to the horse she could not quite make out but recognized by their tone as genuine affection. The inside of the house was spare but clean in a way that reflected real effort rather than natural tidiness. There was a main room that served as both sitting area and kitchen, a cast-iron stove against the far wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that she noted with interest held more volumes than she would have expected, and a braided rug of faded reds and blues on the plank floor. Through a doorway she could see the edge of a cot and a washstand. The walls had a few things hung on them, a calendar, a length of bridle that needed mending, and one thing that surprised her considerably, a framed pencil sketch of a mountain range that was executed with real skill. She was still studying the sketch when Harlan came in through the back door, having washed his hands and face at the pump. He moved to the stove and began building a fire in it with the efficiency of a man who had done exactly this every evening for a very long time alone. "Did you draw that?" she asked, nodding toward the sketch. He glanced at it. Yes, it's very good. It passes the time in winter. She set her satchel on the floor beside one of the chairs and sat down. Have you been on this ranch long? 11 years. He set a cast-iron pan on the stove and moved to the pantry shelf beside it. Came out here with my father. He passed 6 years back. Ranch has been mine since. I'm sorry about your father. Thank you. He said it without the stiff formality people sometimes put around grief, but with a simplicity that told her the wound had healed into something he had made peace with. Where are you from, Miss Lockhart? Philadelphia, originally. I am a correspondent for the Eastern Illustrated Weekly. I have been traveling through the territory for 3 months writing about frontier life for readers who have never seen it. He looked at her then, a full, appraising look, not impolite but honest. That's unusual work for a woman. Yes, she agreed pleasantly. People tell me that fairly often. I find the work considerably more interesting than what they suggest I should be doing instead. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was the near neighbor to one. He turned back to the stove and began laying strips of salt pork in the pan, where they hissed and spit in a familiar, homey way. What brings you to this particular stretch of Texas? He asked. I was trying to reach the settlement at Harlow Creek. There is apparently a community of German immigrant families that has established itself there in the past 2 years. I wanted to write about how they are building their lives. Good people, he said. I trade with them sometimes. Widow Brunner makes the best apple preserves in 3 counties. He said this with such plain, matter-of-fact certainty that she almost laughed. You have strong opinions about apple preserves. A man who isn't paying attention. He put a pot of beans on the back of the stove, beans that had clearly been soaking since morning, and she noted this detail, the evidence that his days followed a rhythm, that he planned ahead, that he was organized in his solitude. They talked through the preparation of supper and through supper itself, which was simple, salt pork and beans and cornbread baked in a covered skillet with a confidence that told her he had cooked for himself so long he had gotten genuinely good at it. She told him about Philadelphia, about the paper, about the assignments that had taken her west, and the things she had seen. She described a cattle drive she had observed near Dodge City, and the cattle towns themselves, and the strange, lawless energy of the buffalo hunters' camps she had passed through. He listened with his full attention in a way she was not accustomed to. Most men she interviewed either dismissed her or talked at her, and here was one who was simply listening, watching her face as she spoke with those clear gray-green eyes. He told her about the ranch in return, economically but with genuine feeling underneath the plain words. The Lazy W brand that his father had registered in 1872. The cattle he ran, a mixed herd that he was slowly improving toward more productive stock. The difficult winter of 1880 that had nearly broken him. The summer drought of last year that had done the same. He spoke about the land with the same affection she had heard in his voice when he spoke to the horse in the barn, not sentimental, not romanticized, but real and deep and earned. It must be lonely, she said, and then wished she had phrased it differently because it sounded like pity and she did not mean it as pity. He considered this without any defensiveness. Sometimes, he said, I wouldn't trade it. I understand that, she said. And she meant it, because she felt the same way about her own work and her own particular brand of solitude. The solitude of a woman who had chosen an unconventional path and found herself somewhat outside the ordinary world as a result. He looked at her with a new kind of attention then, as though that response had surprised him, and she had the distinct feeling that she had passed some test she had not known she was taking. The evening was full dark when she rose to leave, and he walked with her to the buckboard and stood at the mare's head while she climbed up. The sky above them was extraordinary, thick with stars in the way that city skies never were, the Milky Way a bright smear across the dark. You take this road north, he said, pointing. About 2 miles up you will find where it splits. Take the left fork. That puts you on the main road to Harlow Creek, another 3 miles from there. Thank you, she said. for supper and for the directions, and for not being alarmed to find a strange woman sitting on your porch." "I wasn't alarmed," he said simply. He stepped back, and then as she gathered the reins, he said, "If you're writing about the territory, you might want to come back and see this place in proper daylight. There's things about a working cattle ranch that are worth writing about." He paused. "If that's something that interests your readers." She looked at him in the starlight. "I think it very likely does," she said. "Would that be all right with you?" "Yes," he said, and there was something in the single word that she carried with her all the way to Harlow Creek, something she could not entirely name but could not entirely set aside either. She found the settlement without further trouble, checked herself into the simple room that the Brunner family let to travelers, and lay awake longer than she should have, staring at the ceiling and thinking about a pencil sketch of mountains on a limestone wall. She spent 3 days in Harlow Creek, interviewing the German families who had staked their claims there with extraordinary industry and faith. She filled a notebook and a half and used most of a box of photographic plates, and she wrote some of the best material she had produced in months. But on the morning of the 4th day, when she loaded her buckboard and pointed the mare south toward the main road, she did not turn left toward Abilene. She turned right. She told herself it was professional interest. A working cattle ranch, authentically operated, would be excellent material for the series she was building. Her editor had specifically asked her to document a variety of frontier livelihoods. This was entirely reasonable. She pulled up to the Lazy W gate at mid-morning and found it propped open. Through it she could see Harlan Watkins in the near corral with a young horse that was making its strong opinions about the situation very clear, and he was working the animal with a patience and skill that she stopped the buckboard to watch without announcing herself, because it was genuinely worth watching. He talked to the horse the entire time, a low, steady murmur, and he moved with it rather than against it, giving ground when the animal needed ground, holding firm when firmness was what was required, reading the creature with a kind of focused empathy that she found unexpectedly moving. After perhaps 20 minutes, the young horse was standing quietly beside him, its head low, and Harlan laid his hand along the animal's neck with a gentleness that seemed completely natural and completely unself-conscious, because he did not yet know he had an audience. Then he glanced up and saw her, and a complicated thing happened on his face. She would think about it later, trying to identify all its components. Surprise was there, and pleasure, and something cautious that lived alongside the pleasure in an uneasy relationship. He came to the corral fence and leaned on it. "Miss Lockhart, I told you I might come back," she said. "You did." He was looking at her with that careful attention again. "Come to write about the ranch, if you'll still allow it." She stepped down from the buckboard. "I watched you work with that horse. It was something worth writing about, how a man reads an animal that doesn't share his language. There's a story in it." He was quiet for a moment in that way he had, that deliberate quiet that she was beginning to understand was not hesitation but consideration. "Come on then," he said. "I'll show you around properly." He showed her around properly, and it took most of the day. He explained the workings of the ranch with the same plain thoroughness with which he did everything. Nothing performed for her benefit, nothing simplified because she was a woman, just a clear-eyed account of how a cattle operation ran in this part of Texas in this particular decade. He told her about the water rights he was fighting to maintain against a larger neighboring outfit called the Rocking H, owned by a man named Dix Calloway, who had been encroaching on the creek that ran through the northern edge of Harlan's land. "That sounds like a serious problem," she said. They were standing at the creek then, the good clear water running low from the summer heat over flat limestone shelves. "It is," he said. "Calloway runs 4 times my head count. He has lawyers in Austin. I have a clear deed and not much else." He looked at the creek for a long moment. "But this water is mine. My father picked this land for this creek. I'm not going to lose it." There was a quality in how he said it that was not bluster and not threat but simply fact, a man who had decided something and made his peace with the cost of that decision. She wrote it down word for word in her notebook. They ate lunch under the shade of a large live oak near the barn, sitting on upended crates with biscuits he had made that morning and cold coffee from a tin can, and they talked about books. She had noticed his shelf the evening before and had been curious. He had been working through whatever he could find or trade for, and what he had found or traded for was a thoughtful collection. A volume of Emerson, a dog-eared Cooper, 3 books on natural history, a Spanish grammar, 2 agricultural journals, and, somewhat to her delight, a copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, that he admitted he had picked up at an estate sale in Abilene because the title interested him. "Had you read it?" she asked. Yes, he looked at her across the live oak shade, agreed with most of it. She looked at him for a moment. "You are a surprising man, Mr. Watkins." "Harlan," he said. "Harlan," she repeated, and the word felt easier in her mouth than she expected it to. "And you're a surprising woman, Miss Lockhart," he said. "Most people who come to this ranch come to buy cattle or sell something I don't need." "What do I seem like I'm doing?" He thought about it. "Something else entirely," he said, and the near smile was back, the one she was beginning to map the edges of. She stayed until late afternoon, filling most of a notebook, and she accepted his offer of supper again with less internal deliberation than the first time. They sat on the porch afterward in the cooling evening air, the yellow cat appearing from wherever it spent its days and arranging itself across Harlan's boots with complete ownership. "What is the cat's name?" she asked. "Judge," he said. "Why Judge?" "Because he sits on everything and looks disapproving." She laughed, a real laugh, unprepared and unguarded, and it surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. He watched her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that open, careful attention, as though he were committing something to memory. "Caroline," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it in the same way he did everything, without excess but with weight. "How long are you in this part of the territory?" "I had planned to move on to San Angelo next week," she said, "but I find I have more material here than I expected." "How much more time would you need?" She considered her answer honestly rather than strategically, which was perhaps telling in itself. "At least another week," she said. "Possibly 2. There is a great deal worth writing about." She was not thinking entirely about the ranch when she said it, and from the quality of his silence she suspected he knew that. "You're welcome to come back," he said. "Every day if it helps." She came back every day, and it helped, though not exclusively in the ways she had named as justification. She came the next morning to watch the dawn feeding and the morning work with the cattle, which was considerably more physical and complicated than any description she had read of it. She came the morning after that to interview him properly about the history of the Lazy W, and they sat at his table for 3 hours while she asked questions, and he answered them with a thoroughness that told her he had thought about these things, about his father's vision and his own, about what the land meant and what he was building on it, even if he had not had much occasion to put those thoughts into words for another person. She came on a Wednesday to find him in a difficult conversation at the gate with 2 men from the Rocking H, big, flat-faced men, with the particular arrogance of people who work for someone powerful, and have decided to borrow some of that power for themselves. They were telling Harlan that Dix Calloway intended to run a fence line that would effectively cut off the upper portion of the creek from the Lazy W's grazing land. Harlan was very still and very quiet while they talked, and she noticed that this particular quality of stillness was a different one than his usual considered quiet. This one had an edge to it. "You tell Calloway that fence goes up on my land. I will take it down," he said, when the men had finished. "And you tell him his lawyers in Austin can read my deed, because it is recorded and it is clear." The men looked at her, then at Harlan, then rode away without another word. Harlan watched them go with an expression that was difficult to read entirely but was not afraid. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. 2 years, he said. He turned from the gate and walked back toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him. "Calloway wants this land. He wants the creek water. He has been pushing at the edges since my father died, testing what I'll do." "And what will you do?" "Hold," he said simply. She looked at his profile, the set jaw, the steady eyes watching something ahead that she could not see. "I would like to write about this," she said carefully. "The land disputes on the frontier. They are part of the story of this place." He was quiet for a moment. "If you think it would help," he glanced at her. "I don't want you in the middle of a fight that isn't yours." "Stories are always my fight," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Then write it," he said. By the end of the first week, she had material for 4 full articles and a growing awareness that the material she was most interested in had nothing to do with her notebook. She was interested in the way Harlan moved through his days with a quiet completeness that she found deeply restful after years of noise and hustle, and the constant performance of competence that city life demanded. She was interested in the way he noticed things, the way a change in the wind made him look at the sky, the way he tracked the small signs of his land the way some men read newspapers, with attention and interpretation. She was interested in the particular way he looked at her when she said something that surprised him or pleased him, and the fact that both apparently happened with some frequency. She was honest enough with herself to name what she was doing, even if she was not yet ready to say it out loud. She was falling for a cowboy in the middle of Texas, a man who lived 11 miles from the nearest town on a piece of land he would defend with his last breath, a man who read Wollstonecraft and drew mountains and cooked beans and held the earth under his boots like it was part of him. She was falling for him in the particular, helpless way that happens when someone is so genuinely, unperformatively themselves that you cannot look away. The complication, of course, was that she could not tell what he was doing. He was courteous. He was warm in his spare, steady way. He looked at her too long and too often for it to be entirely accounted for by ordinary friendliness. But he made no move, said no word, that crossed the line between hospitality and something more, and she was not sure if this was because he did not feel what she thought she felt, or because he did and was not certain what to do with it, or because he was a man who held his cards very close indeed. She got her answer on a Saturday, in a way she did not expect. She had arrived at the ranch to find Harlan on the roof of the barn, replacing a section of damaged shingles, and she had parked the buckboard and called up to him, and he had called down that she should make herself coffee on the stove because he had another hour of work up there. She had gone into the house and made coffee and sat at the table with her notebook, and she had been sitting there perhaps 20 minutes when the wind shifted, and she heard a sound outside that was not the wind and not the cattle. She went to the window. 3 men on horseback had come into the yard from the south, and they were not the men from the rocking H she had seen before. These were different men, harder looking, with the particular quality of men who hired out their difficulty to whoever needed it. She heard one of them shout up at Harlan on the barn roof, and she heard Harlan's voice come back, steady as ever. She could not hear the words, but she could read the posture of every person involved, and she did not like what she was reading. She stepped out onto the porch. All 5 faces turned toward her, Harlan's from the barn roof and the 3 strangers from their horses, and she was glad she had the presence of mind to bring her coffee cup with her because it gave her something to do with her hands, which she needed. She stepped to the porch railing and looked at the men with the particular composure she had learned in 3 years of approaching armed strangers in rough country to ask them questions. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "Can I help you, gentlemen? Who are you?" The nearest one said, "Caroline Lockhart, Eastern Illustrated Weekly," she said. "And you?" The 3 men exchanged a look. She had learned that introducing yourself as press occasionally made people cautious and occasionally made them angry and very occasionally made them helpful, and she watched which way this was going to fall. "We're just talking to the man," the nearest one said, with somewhat less aggression than before. "Of course," she said. She pulled out her notebook and pencil from her apron pocket. She always had them there. "And you are," they left within 3 minutes. She was not entirely certain why, except that she had kept writing in her notebook the whole time and asking their names in a politely relentless way, and there was something about being documented, being made real and specific and named, that certain men found deeply uncomfortable. Harlan came down from the barn roof and stood in the yard watching them go. Then he turned and looked at her on the porch. "Thank you," he said. "What did they want?" "To suggest that I reconsider my position on the creek." He came to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. The sun was behind him and she could not see his face entirely, but she could hear something in his voice that was different from his usual evenness. "They work for Calloway. I assumed as much." He was quiet for a moment. "You weren't afraid," he said. "I was somewhat afraid," she said honestly, "but I have found that a notebook is an excellent prop." He looked at her with an expression that she could now read clearly enough to name it. It was the expression of a man looking at something he did not entirely expect to find in his life and was not sure what to do about the fact that it was there. Then he said, "Come down off the porch for a minute." She came down. They stood in the yard a few feet apart, the hot morning sun making the whole world smell of dry grass and cedar. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." He was looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was choosing his words. "I don't know what your plans are," he said, "and I know that you have a life that is not here and work that takes you elsewhere. I know all of that." He stopped. "But I think you should know that the past 10 days have been the first time in a very long while that this place has felt like something other than just a place I live." He looked at her then, directly, in that clear, honest way. "I don't know what to do with that information. But I thought you should have it." The honesty of it reached her in a place words rarely reached. She stood in the bright Texas morning and looked at this man who had said the true thing instead of the safe thing and felt something shift in her chest like a door opening on a hinge that had been still for years. "Harlan," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. I am not in a hurry to leave," she said. He looked at her. "I have been telling myself it is because of the material for the articles," she said. "And the material is genuinely excellent. But I am a woman who has built her life on honest observation, and I owe it to both of us to be honest. I am not in a hurry to leave, and it is not only because of the material." He was very still. "No, no," she held his gaze. "The ranch is part of it. You are the rest of it." Something in his face changed entirely, like weather clearing. Not dramatically, not with any theatrics, simply a shift from guarded to open. And she thought that in that moment she was seeing Harlan Watkins without any of the careful management he put between himself and the world, and what she saw was steady and warm and real. "I'm a man with a disputed cattle ranch in the middle of Texas," he said. "I don't have a great deal to offer someone from Philadelphia. You have offered me the best coffee I've had since I left the East, a genuinely illuminating conversation about Mary Wollstonecraft, and the only honest attention I have been given in 3 months of traveling," she said. "That is considerably more than you seem to think." He laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him the way hers had been surprised out of her that first night on the porch, and it transformed his face entirely, and she thought she would do a great many things to see that again. He put his hand out to her, not to shake this time, simply to offer, palm up, and she looked at it for a moment and then put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a care that was almost painful in its gentleness. They stood like that in the yard of the Lazy W with the sun climbing overhead and the cattle moving in the far corral and the yellow cat watching them from the barn doorway with judicial indifference. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If that's something you'd consider." "I would consider it," she said. "Though I should tell you up front that I am not a conventional woman and I am unlikely to become one." "I noticed that approximately 30 seconds after you sat down in my rocking chair without permission," he said. "I was not looking for conventional." She smiled at him, a full smile, all of it, and watched him take it in like sunlight. The days that followed had a different quality to them, the same rhythm of work and talk and shared meals, but with something added that changed the color of everything the way a small amount of light changes an entire dark room. He rode out to meet her at the gate in the mornings instead of waiting at the barn. He saved things to tell her, small observations and occurrences from his days that he thought would interest her, and they did. She began bringing books from Harlow Creek's small lending shelf to discuss with him, and they disagreed with such productive energy that she started looking forward to the disagreements as much as the agreements. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks into the courtship, standing at the buckboard as she was about to head back to Harlow Creek, in the particular quality of light that comes in the last half hour before full dark when the sky is all rose and indigo and the land glows amber. He had been helping her up to the seat, and he stopped with his hand still extended and looked at her with a question in his eyes, and she answered it by leaning forward. And the kiss was everything the conversation between them had been, unhurried and genuine and full of attention. She drove back to Harlow Creek with the stars coming out above her and a feeling she had not experienced before, or perhaps had experienced in small, diluted forms that she had not recognized as belonging to a larger thing. She recognized it now. She recognized it entirely. She wrote to her editor that week, a letter that requested an extended stay in the Texas territory on the grounds that she had found a story of exceptional depth and complexity, all of which was true. She did not specify that the story was also, increasingly, personal. Her editor wrote back in 3 weeks, as letters traveled in 1883, with an enthusiastic agreement that the dispatches she had been sending were among the finest the paper had published in a year, and that she should by all means continue. She was sitting on the porch of the Lazy W reading this letter to Harlan when the rider from the Rocking H came at a hard gallop up the road, which was unusual enough that both of them stood. The rider was not one of the hard men from before, but a young Mexican vaquero named Miguel who worked for both ranches at different times, a freelance arrangement common in the territory. He pulled his horse up at the gate and spoke quickly, with an urgency that needed no translation. Dix Calloway had filed a legal claim in the county seat at Sweetwater, asserting water rights to the creek based on a survey he had commissioned that he claimed showed the upper portion of the creek running through land he owned. The legal process had been filed 3 days ago. Harlan had 30 days to respond. Harlan listened to all of this without visible change in his expression, but his jaw had gone to that stone-carving quality she associated with him facing things he could not simply manage by being careful and patient. He thanked Miguel, who refused payment and rode away with the look of a man who had delivered news he found personally distasteful. Harlan sat down on the porch steps. He put his forearms on his knees and looked at the ground for a long moment. "Tell me about the deed," Caroline said. She sat beside him on the steps. He told her. The deed was clear. The creek was clearly within the bounds of the Lazy W as surveyed when his father had filed it in 1872. But Calloway's surveyor had apparently drawn a new line that disputed the original, and in the legal world of 1883 Texas, having a lawyer and a survey and the money to press the matter in court could sometimes outweigh what was written on a deed, especially when the deed holder did not have equal resources. "Do you have a lawyer?" she asked. "No. Can you get one?" "Maybe." He looked at the road where Miguel had gone. "It costs money I don't have easy access to," she thought. "What is the county seat?" "Sweetwater." "How far?" "Day and a half by horse." "I am going to Sweetwater," she said. He looked at her. "Caroline." "I am going to Sweetwater," she said firmly, "because I have something Calloway does not expect you to have, which is a pen and a platform. The Eastern Illustrated Weekly has 50,000 readers in the eastern states, and a significant number of them are the kind of people who write letters to their congressmen and have opinions about land rights and the rule of law on the frontier. If Calloway thinks he can use corrupt legal proceedings to steal a man's water rights, I would like very much to explain that to 50,000 interested parties." She looked at Harlan with absolute steadiness. "With your permission." He was very quiet. She watched something move through his expression that was complex and layered, pride and gratitude and concern for her, and something else she thought might be wonder. "I'm not a man who finds it easy to accept help," he said. "I know," she said, "but you are also not a man who is wrong about what is right. "This is right, let me help." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." She went to Sweetwater. She spent 2 days there, first at the land office pulling the original survey records and the deed, which she photographed with painstaking care, and then at the county courthouse examining Calloway's filing, and then sitting in the small hotel room writing an article that was the finest work of disciplined fury she had ever produced. She described the Lazy W with love because she had come to know it that way. She described Harlan's father and the 11 years of labor that had built the ranch. She described the water rights dispute with scrupulous factual care, citing the deed, citing the date, citing the discrepancy between the original survey and Calloway's commissioned one. She did not call Calloway a thief in so many words because she did not need to. The facts called him that clearly enough on their own. She also, while in Sweetwater, found a lawyer. His name was James Aldrich, a small, precise man of about 50 who had a reputation for taking cases on deferred payment when he believed in them. She showed him the deed and the documentation. He agreed to represent Harlan. She came back to the Lazy W on the third day, dusty and tired, and considerably more satisfied than the dust and tiredness could diminish. Harlan was at the gate when she arrived, as though he had been watching the road. He helped her down from the buckboard without ceremony and held her hands a moment longer than necessary and looked at her face with an attention that was both assessing and relieved. "Well," he said. She told him about the article. She told him about James Aldrich. She told him about the deed records and the photographs. He listened to all of it, and then he pulled her forward and held her against him, his chin against the top of her head, one hand at her back, and she felt the tension in him release like a rope going slack. She put her arms around him and held on. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "This is still going to be a fight," she said honestly. "I know." He did not let go. "Thank you anyway." She stayed at the Lazy W that night, sleeping in a proper arrangement, her bedroll on the porch with the door open and him inside, because they were being careful of her reputation in ways that the territory and the time required. But in the morning they sat on the porch with coffee and watched the sunrise paint the scrubland in extraordinary colors, and she thought she had never been as comfortable anywhere as she was on this particular porch beside this particular man. The article was published 5 weeks later. She received the printed copy by mail in Harlow Creek and brought it to the ranch and read it to Harlan while he worked on a piece of harness at the table. He did not say anything when she finished reading. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she had learned to love. "That's good," he said simply. "It is," she agreed. "I wrote it very well." He smiled fully then, not the near smile but the full real one. "You're not what anyone would expect," he said. "No," she agreed. "I am not." The article moved through the Eastern press the way certain articles do when they have the particular quality of being both well-written and morally clear. It was reprinted in 2 New York papers and referenced in an editorial in a Boston publication. Letters arrived at the county courthouse in Sweetwater, and at least one letter, James Aldrich reported with barely suppressed satisfaction, arrived at the office of a Texas state legislator who happened to be on a committee concerned with land rights and was extremely interested in the suggestion of corrupt survey practices. Dix Calloway did not back down immediately, because men like Calloway seldom did, but his lawyers became somewhat less confident in their correspondence, and the county judge, who was up for election in November and was watching the political weather with professional attention, proved less obliging to Calloway's filing than Calloway had apparently anticipated. The case stretched through the fall. Harlan rode to Sweetwater twice to meet with James Aldrich, and Caroline accompanied him both times because she was still in the territory and because she had discovered that she could not particularly imagine being somewhere else. She had sent 3 more articles to the weekly. She had also sent a letter to her editor explaining that the Frontier assignment was ongoing and that she had found material of considerable long-term depth. Her editor had responded with increasing curiosity and decreasing patience for delay, but he had continued to publish everything she sent, which told her he was not yet truly worried. She was worried. Not about the Calloway situation, in which she had reasonable faith, but about the question she had been carrying since August like a stone in a pocket, the question of what she was doing, and what she wanted, and whether those two things could coexist with the life that Harlan Watkins lived in this particular piece of Texas. She raised this question on a Sunday in October, sitting with him at the creek in the warm autumn light, watching the clear water run over the limestone shelves with a steadiness that felt like a kind of answer to things if you looked at it long enough. "I need to go back to Philadelphia," she said. He was quiet. She watched his hands resting on his knees, not tense, not entirely relaxed. "For how long?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I have to file the full series in person. I have to deal with my apartment, my commitments. And I have to," she paused, searching for the right words, "I have to think clearly about some things, and I find that difficult to do here." "Because of me," he said. It was not a question. "Because of you," she agreed. He picked up a small, flat stone from the creek bank and turned it in his fingers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "This ranch is not going anywhere. Whatever you need to figure out, you take the time to figure it out." "You don't know what I'm trying to figure out," she said. "I know some of it," he said. He looked at her. "You're trying to figure out whether what you feel about this place and about me is something that can live alongside who you are and what you need, or whether it's the kind of feeling that's real but can't be made practical." The accuracy of it stopped her entirely. "Yes," she said after a moment. "That's exactly it. I think about the same question," he said. "You're a woman who's built a life that's extraordinary. You travel and you write and you see things. I'm a man with 340 acres and a water rights dispute and a cat named Judge." He looked at the creek. "I don't want to ask you to make yourself small." "You never have," she said. "I wouldn't," he said, "but geography is what it is, and what I have is here." He turned the stone once more and set it down. "So take the time, think it through. I'll be here when you've thought." She left for Philadelphia in November when the Texas autumn was just beginning to shade toward the mild winter that was all this part of the state permitted. She drove the buckboard to Abilene, sold it there along with the mare, which was a practical decision that made her considerably sadder than she had anticipated, and took the train east. The train journey was 4 days, and she had a great deal of time to think. She thought about the life she had in Philadelphia, the apartment near Chestnut Street with the good northern light, the editorial meetings at the weekly's offices, the circle of colleagues and friends she had built over years in journalism. She thought about the ambition that had brought her west in the first place, the hunger to document the real world and bring it to people who could not see it themselves. She thought about what she wanted her life to be. And she thought about Harlan Watkins, standing at the creek in October light, telling her he would not ask her to make herself small, and meaning it with his whole honest self. Philadelphia was cold in November in ways that Texas had not prepared her for, or perhaps she had simply forgotten how cold it was, and busy in ways that had once felt natural and now felt somewhat exhausting. She filed her articles, all 6 of them, and they were published to the best reception of her career. The land rights piece particularly generating correspondence from readers all over the country. Her editor offered her a staff position with a salary that would have seemed like a dream 6 months ago. She sat with the offer for a week. She wrote letters to Harlan during that week, long ones, because the distance made it easier to say things she might have been less direct about in person, and his letters came back with the same careful economy he brought to speech, but with something underneath, the plain words that she could hear as clearly as she could hear his voice saying them. He told her about the cattle, about the ranch in winter, about a book he had found in Abilene and what he thought of it. He told her the Calloway case had gone well in a preliminary hearing. James Aldrich was cautiously optimistic. He told her Judge had taken to sleeping in the rocking chair with a proprietary air. In the last letter at the very end of it, after all the ranch news and all the book talk, he wrote simply, "I miss you in a specific way, not a general way. I miss the particular person that you are." She read this sentence 6 times. Then she wrote her reply, and her reply contained her answer, not to the question of whether she loved him, which had resolved itself sometime around October without much drama, but to the larger question she had gone east to think through. She had been afraid, she realized, that loving someone who lived in one place would require her to stop being the person who needed to move through the world. But what she had been writing about for 3 months was people building lives in new places, people who took what they were and brought it somewhere and made it grow. She had been documenting resilience and adaptation, and the courage of choosing something specific over the safety of remaining unspecific. She had been writing about exactly this, and had somehow not applied it to herself. The frontier was not finished being written about. The Lazy W was not finished having a story. The Eastern Illustrated Weekly would not stop publishing articles simply because their correspondent was based in Texas rather than Philadelphia. Correspondents lived places and filed from those places. That was the entire model. She declined the staff position. She bought a train ticket west. She arrived back in Abilene in December when the plains were brown and the sky was the brilliant hard blue of a Texas winter. She hired a horse from the livery stable because she had already sold her mare and was not yet in a position to replace her, and she rode the 11 miles to the Lazy W in the cold morning air with her bags tied to the saddle and her breath making clouds. He was chopping firewood in the yard when she came through the gate. He heard the horse and looked up, and then he set the axe down against the woodpile with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling a strong reaction, and he stood straight and watched her come. She stopped the horse and dismounted and walked to him across the yard. "I declined the staff position," she said. He was very still. "I can write from here," she said. "I can write about this territory for years. There is more story here than I could cover in a decade." She stopped a foot from him. "And the rest of my life is here too, if you want it." Something in his face came completely apart and remade itself in one long, unguarded moment. He stepped forward and took her face in both his rough, work-worn hands, and he looked at her with everything visible, the loneliness and the hope and the love that had been building since August like a river against a dam. "I want it," he said. "I want all of it. I want you." He kissed her then, in the cold December yard with firewood stacked behind him, and cattle in the corrals, and the yellow cat appearing from somewhere to observe the proceedings from a safe distance. And she kissed him back with the full conviction of someone who has made a decision, and found it absolutely right. They were married in the spring, at the small church in Harlow Creek that had been built by the German families over the previous winter. A simple whitewashed limestone structure with a wooden floor that was still fragrant with new timber. Widow Brunner made the cake, which involved apple preserves in some capacity that Harlan declared to be completely vindicated as a priority. James Aldrich came from Sweetwater and sat in the front row beside Miguel the vaquero, who brought his wife and 3 children and seemed personally delighted by the entire occasion. Caroline wore a dress she had brought from Philadelphia, a practical blue wool that was not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but that she liked enormously, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Harlan had found on the south side of the property, where the spring came first. He stood at the altar in his good coat, the one she had never seen before that day, and he looked at her walking toward him with the full open expression that she had come to understand as the face he showed her, and very few others. The minister asked them the traditional questions, and they answered them in steady, clear voices, and when it was done and they walked back down the short aisle together, she felt the weight and rightness of it settle around her like something that had always been intended. The Calloway case concluded 3 weeks later, as if the universe had been waiting for the wedding to dispense with other business. The county judge, after considerable legal argument that James Aldrich conducted with the precision of a man who had prepared very thoroughly, ruled in favor of the original Lazy W deed and survey. The creek was unambiguously Harlan's. Calloway's commissioned survey was found to contain material errors, a finding that carried its own implications, and Calloway's lawyers withdrew quietly. James Aldrich wrote a letter to Caroline that contained barely more than the facts of the ruling, but she could hear his satisfaction in every sentence. She wrote about the outcome in the Weekly, a final installment on the land rights case that drew a letter from a Washington legal journal interested in the implications for frontier property law. She wrote back to the journal with considerable interest and the suggestion that there was much more to discuss on the topic. Life on the Lazy W settled into a rhythm that surprised her constantly by how much it suited her. She had feared the quiet, she realized in retrospect, feared that a life in one place would feel like a cage. It did not. It felt like a base from which things became possible. She wrote from the ranch on a desk Harlan built her against the window that faced east, where the morning light was best, and she sent articles steadily to the Weekly and occasionally to other publications. And her byline became known in a way it had not been when she was in constant motion, because the articles she wrote now had a depth of place and knowledge that came only from staying. She learned to ride well properly on a new mare she bought in the spring, a gray named Ink. She learned the ranch work not at Harlan's level but enough to be genuinely useful, to read the cattle, to help with calving season when the nights were long and cold, and sleep was something that happened in pieces between crises. She learned the land in all its seasons, the brown winter scrubland going green in March, the bluebonnets that came in April like a miracle every year, the hot, brilliant summer, the amber and rose of fall. Harlan read everything she wrote, sitting at the table after supper with the lamp turned up, reading carefully, and he told her honestly what he thought, which was more useful than most editorial opinions she received because he was both genuinely intelligent and genuinely invested in her success. When an article was not yet what it needed to be, he would say so, not harshly but clearly, and she had learned to trust this completely. She helped him, too, with the land rights correspondence that continued even after the Calloway ruling, because the larger issue of frontier water and land disputes was unresolved in Texas and would be for years, and she had become something of an authority on the documentation of them. She wrote letters with him, helped him articulate to James Aldrich the things that needed articulating. She watched him grow over the months from a man who had managed his isolation, by becoming entirely self-sufficient into a man who had learned what it was to have a partner, to be known and supported and challenged by someone who was fully present. There was a moment in December of that first year of marriage, late one evening when the winter wind was pressing at the limestone walls and the fire in the stove was making the main room warm and orange-lit, when she was reading at the desk, and he was mending a bridle at the table and Judge was on the rocking chair and everything was completely ordinary, and she looked up and caught him watching her with such a look that she had to set her book down. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just aware of how different this is." "Different from what?" "From 6 years of evenings alone," he said simply and went back to the bridle. She sat with that for a moment and then she said, "Harlan, I'm glad I took the wrong turn." He looked up. The firelight was on his face. "Two wrong turns," he said, and there was so much warmth in his voice that she almost could not bear it. "I'm glad you took both of them." The following autumn Caroline discovered she was expecting their first child, which she announced to Harlan on a Sunday morning in September in the kitchen while he was making coffee, and he stood with the coffee pot in his hand for a full 5 seconds without speaking, which was the longest she had ever seen him at a loss for words. And then he set the pot down very carefully and crossed the room and held her like the world depended on the careful holding. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said, her voice somewhat muffled against his shoulder. "Are you?" He started and stopped. "I am extremely pleased," she said. "Are you?" "Yes." The word came out rough and simple and honest. "Yes, I am." She wrote her mother in Philadelphia, who had long since made her peace with Caroline's unconventional choices, and responded to the news with a letter of such warm excitement that Caroline read it to Harlan 3 times, and he listened to all 3 readings with affectionate patience. The winter was a good one, mild enough to manage comfortably, and Harlan built a second room onto the house with the help of Miguel and 2 other neighbors. A practical project he approached with the same methodical care he brought to everything, though she noticed he measured certain things 3 times instead of his usual 2, which she found entirely endearing. Their son was born in April, when the bluebonnets were out across the south pasture, delivered by the capable hands of a midwife from Harlow Creek named Gertrude Haas, who was Widow Brunner's niece, and had the no-nonsense competence of a woman who had brought many Texas children into the world and intended to keep doing so. The labor was long but not dangerous, and when it was over Caroline was tired to her bones and more purely happy than she had imagined the combination of exhausted and happy could produce. Harlan sat beside her on the bed with the infant against his chest, this large, quiet man holding his son with a tenderness that made something tighten beautifully in her throat, and he looked at the baby's face with an expression she had never seen before, something beyond love, something that was love's magnitude adjusted for eternity. "What shall we call him?" Caroline asked. They had discussed names but reached no conclusion. Harlan was quiet for a moment, looking at the baby. "Robert," he said. After my father. She had met Robert Watkins only through Harlan's stories, but she knew him through those stories as a man worth honoring. "Robert Watkins," she said, trying the sound of it. "Yes." "Robert Thomas Watkins," Harlan said, "if you agree to Thomas." Thomas had been her father's name, and he had been gone for 5 years. She looked at her husband, who had remembered this without being asked and had offered it without ceremony, and she felt again the particular quality of being known by this man, being seen in the specific way he saw, and she reached for his hand and held it. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." Robert Thomas Watkins turned out to have his father's temperament, which was an extraordinary gift in an infant, the quality of watchful patience that expressed itself in a baby as an almost startling calm, large gray-green eyes that tracked the room and the people in it with serious attention. He grew quickly, as healthy children do, and the lazy W expanded to accommodate him in the way that good homes expand to accommodate new life, with some rearrangement and some creative problem-solving and a great deal of joy. Caroline's work did not stop for Robert's arrival, though it adjusted. She wrote during nap times and early mornings before the household woke, and she wrote in the evenings when Harlan took the baby on his customary walk around the yard, a ritual he had established from Robert's earliest weeks, talking to his son about the ranch and the land and the cattle in the same low, steady murmur with which he talked to horses, and which seemed to have the same settling effect. She wrote an article about motherhood on the frontier, which her editor published with a personal note saying it was the most moving piece she had submitted in 4 years. She was slightly embarrassed by this assessment but could not entirely argue with it, because she had written it from a place of genuine experience and genuine feeling, and those were always the articles that carried the furthest. The ranch expanded in the years that followed with a deliberateness that reflected both Harlan's nature and his improved circumstances. The Callaway dispute had cost him money and time, but the resolution of it had secured the water that made expansion possible, and he added to his herd systematically over the course of 3 years, improving the bloodlines with a studied patience and producing cattle that brought better prices at market. He hired 2 permanent hands, brothers named Torres, Eduardo and Patricio, who were skilled and dependable, and became in time something close to family, in the way that the frontier sometimes created family out of proximity and shared work and mutual reliability. Caroline expanded too, in ways she had not predicted. The Eastern Illustrated Weekly remained her primary outlet, but she had begun contributing to other publications, including the Texas Land Journal, which was interested in her ongoing documentation of property rights issues, and a women's magazine in Boston that was interested in her observations on frontier life from the perspective of a woman who had chosen it deliberately. Her byline carried weight now in a way it had not when she set out from Philadelphia with her leather satchel and her optimism, and she used that weight with the purposeful awareness of someone who understood that having a platform was a responsibility. She wrote about the Apache and Comanche dispossession with the factual care and moral clarity that she brought to the Callaway case, acknowledging the fundamental injustice of the policies that had driven native peoples from the land that the frontier story so often romanticized as empty. These articles were harder to place and generated more contentious correspondence, but she wrote them anyway, because the honest observation of the world required acknowledging its wrongs, and because she had seen enough of the territory to understand that the frontier myth, the heroic emptiness tamed by brave settlers, left out the full truth of what had been here before and what had been destroyed. She talked about this with Harlan on the porch in the evenings, and he was not a man who had thought through all of it as deeply as she had, but he was a man with honest eyes who listened to what those eyes showed him, and he agreed that the truth of the land included its whole history. Robert was 3 when Caroline found she was expecting again, which she discovered this time during the spring branding, a piece of timing she found absurdly appropriate. She told Harlan in the evening after the branding was done and they were both dusty and tired on the porch, and he looked at her with the same arrested stillness he had produced the first time, coffee pot absent on this occasion but the quality of the moment identical. "Good," he said when he could speak. "That's good." "Very good," she agreed. Their second child was a girl, born the following January in a winter ice storm that made travel from Harlow Creek complicated enough that Harlan himself was more involved in the delivery than either of them had planned, with Gertrude Haas arriving by some miracle 20 minutes after the birth, slightly windblown and entirely professional. They named her Alina, a name Caroline had always loved, and Harlan Watkins arrived in the world with very different energy than her brother, announcing her existence loudly and with considerable conviction, and continuing to do so throughout the rest of that winter and into spring. She had Caroline's coloring, and Harlan noted with the satisfied expression of someone watching a pattern emerge, her mother's particular way of looking at things as though she intended to understand them completely or die in the attempt. "She is exactly like you," Harlan said one afternoon, watching Alina at 18 months, systematically disassemble a wooden toy and examine each piece with thorough concentration. "God help you both," Caroline said, but she was smiling. "I would not change a single thing about it," he said. The years settled into a life, which is different from settling into a routine, because a life accumulates and deepens and surprises you, while a routine merely repeats. The Lazy W was a real operation now, profitable and respected, and Harlan was a known figure in the county, someone whose judgment other ranchers sought and whose word was considered reliable in any dealing. Caroline was known in the territory and beyond it, her writing having reached a readership she could not have mapped from that first dusty arrival at an apparently abandoned ranch in the summer of 1883. They had their fights, because they were two strong-willed, opinionated people who each had deep convictions and were accustomed to defending them. But their fights had the quality of two people who were fundamentally committed to each other working out a real disagreement, and they resolved with the same honesty that had built the foundation in the first place. She had once, in the middle of a disagreement about the proper approach to a particular article, told him in some heat that she did not need his editorial opinion. He had looked at her steadily and said that she was right. She did not need it, and then he had gone out to the barn, and she had spent 10 minutes being quite sure she was correct before realizing she had been unfair, and she had gone out to the barn and told him so, and he had said he had perhaps been too blunt about it, and they had walked back to the house together and finished the conversation more usefully. They were good at coming back to each other. That was, she thought, the truest measure of a marriage, not the absence of friction but the consistent choosing of return. Robert grew into a quiet, serious boy who loved horses with the same depth his father did, and showed early signs of the same spatial and mathematical intelligence, taking apart the wagon wheel at age 7 to understand how it worked and managing to put it largely back together. Alina grew into a fierce, curious girl who commandeered her mother's notebooks at every opportunity, and once attempted to interview Eduardo Torres about his childhood in Chihuahua with a persistence that had made the man laugh until he cried. Caroline wrote all of it, or the essence of it, in the articles about frontier life that continued to be the primary record of the territory in the Eastern press. She wrote about ranching and drought and community and survival and love, always love in all its forms, the love of land and work and neighbor and family, and she wrote about it with the authority of someone who had chosen it fully, without half-heartedness, without reservation. In the fall of 1891, 8 years after she had first pulled her buckboard through the lazy W gate thinking the ranch was abandoned, she sat on the porch with Harlan in the long autumn evening light, the two of them in the rocking chairs that now stood side by side, because Harlan had built a second one the first winter she was there, and she had not thought to ask why until much later. Robert was in the barn helping Eduardo with the evening feeding, his 11-year-old voice carrying through the still air with questions about the horses. Alina, 9, was inside at the table with a book and a persistence that would not be interrupted by anything less than the actual end of the world. Judge had died 2 winters ago, at an age Harlan calculated to be approximately 17 years, which seemed about right for an animal of such uncompromising personal authority. There was now a new cat, gray this time, named Prosecutor, who was in Caroline's lap at this moment expressing approval of the evening through a continuous, self-satisfied rumbling. She had been reading through her journal as she sometimes did in the evenings, and she looked up from it now at the land around her, the big darkening sky, the cedar and mesquite and the good limestone hills in the distance, the corrals where the cattle moved in the last light, the barn with its warm gold glow from the lantern within. Harlan, she said. He was reading, too, the new agricultural journal she had brought from Abilene on her last trip. Do you remember the summer I arrived? He looked up. Yes. I pulled up to this gate and I was entirely certain no one lived here, she said. The fence was down and the porch roof was sagging, and I thought it was completely abandoned. I'd had a difficult year, he said. There was a dry humor in it. I was letting some things go. I nearly did not come through the gate, she said. I very nearly just turned around and found another road. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the evening land. I used to think about what I was waiting for, he said. This place, living this life, I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it, but there was a thing missing that I couldn't name. He looked at her, and after all these years his look still had the quality of his full attention, still had the care in it that she had first noticed in a dusty yard in August 1883. And then a woman I had never seen before was sitting in my rocking chair without permission, and she looked at me like she intended to understand everything about this place, and I thought, well, there it is. There it is, she agreed softly. He reached over between the chairs and she took his hand, his work-rough, capable hand that she had been holding for 8 years, and that still felt like the most natural thing in the world. The land stretched out before them, amber in the setting sun, all 340 acres of it, clear-deeded and water-righteous and good. Behind them, Robert's voice came from the barn, asking Eduardo something about how to tell a horse's age by its teeth. Inside, Alina was turning a page with decisive authority. The new cat purred. The evening star appeared above the western hills, sharp and bright in the darkening sky. She had come to document the frontier and found instead the specific, particular thing she had not known she was looking for. A man who had been waiting on this exact piece of earth, quietly and completely, for someone like her. And she had been out in the wide world, moving and looking and writing, waiting in her own way for something she had not known to look for, but had recognized the instant she stopped looking and simply walked through an open gate. It was, she thought, the best story she had ever been part of. Better than any she had written. Better than any she could fully capture in words, though she had tried in all the articles and in the journals she kept privately, just for herself, to put it down. The feeling of a life that was whole. The feeling of being known. The feeling of a man's hand in yours at the end of a long day on land that was yours together, in all the ways things can be shared. The stars were coming out now, the way they did in Texas, suddenly and in abundance, as though the sky had been waiting all day to show what it could do. The Milky Way spread itself overhead in its old, familiar abundance, and she tipped her head back to look at it, and felt Harlan's hand tighten around hers, and heard her children in the barn and in the house, and thought, with the full, quiet conviction of someone who has looked honestly at her life, that she would not change a single thing. Not the wrong turns. Not the 6 hours on the wrong road. Not the moment she had stood at this gate thinking it was abandoned, seeing only the sagging fence and the drooping roof, and deciding to push through anyway. 2 wrong turns had brought her here, to this porch, to this man, to this life. And the life was everything, generous and specific and real, rooted in limestone and good water and years of choosing the true thing over the easy thing together. The night settled around the lazy W like a blessing. Inside, Alina called out that she needed someone to help her understand a word in her book, and Harlan rose from his chair with an ease that 11 years of honest labor had not yet diminished, and called back that he was coming, and went inside. Caroline remained on the porch a moment longer, her hand still warm from his, the cat settling more firmly in her abandoned lap, listening to the sound of her husband's voice explaining a word to their daughter with the same patient, thorough attention he brought to everything. She picked up her notebook from the porch rail, opened it to a fresh page, and began to write.